Hello and welcome to the Tuesday night live stream to look at designing with fire. Welcome to everybody who was able to join in this evening. I look forward to sharing some thoughts into the world of fire management and mitigation, both on the level of personal risk assessment, as well as what we can do around our home and garden, and then when it comes to addressing climate change. If this is your first time here with us on a live stream, feel free, if you have any questions throughout the evening, to drop your thoughts or questions into the chat, and I will get to them as I'm able throughout our time together. So when it comes to designing for fire, this was a different conversation for me because I live in a really very water-rich area here on the East Coast, and that there are not usually large-scale fires of any kind. Most of our fires, if there are any at all in a year, are relatively localized or the result of some kind of negligence. So this was something that I enjoyed looking into. I had studied woodland practices and forest management practices in graduate school, and so was able to apply some of those ideas along with the emergency management pieces that we've spoken about previously, to looking at how we can use all of those different concepts and permaculture design to come up with a plan and a way that we can work in the immediacy of the now, something that we can do more long-term as we develop our designs around a homestead, or if we're in a town or city and are looking for ways to mitigate risks there, and then also more long-term in working with the issues that will arise with climate change. Now, I start this discussion with the personal risk assessment because of that idea of starting with permaculture from the inside out, and that we want to start with what is closest to us and is most likely to impact us so that we can then take steps against that. And I also like this space to begin because we can prepare for what is most likely to happen first and look at our personal space and ability to be impacted. And so when I look at this, what does the historical record of where we live have to say about the risks when it comes to fire and where we are? What are the ways that they manifest? Is there a fire season where you are, like there is on the West Coast from the conversation with Matt Fidler about wildfires in California? There's a fire season and that can be expected. Well, if you live in a place like that, then there's a much different fire risk than if you live in a place, as Jason is pointing out, that is one of the few places on the planet where you don't normally have to worry about these kinds of issues. So here on the East Coast, I don't normally think about fire. When doing a risk assessment, fire is probably the lowest of the natural disasters that I would come to think of. Hurricanes come through all the time. With fracking that was happening in Pennsylvania, there were, ground tremors and such, but I know that that's not the case for many, many people. And so looking at when was the last time that a fire came through, checking with your local fire services and organizations that help to fight wildfires, and what are their mitigation efforts. When you see warnings about the risk that a fire is high, being able to say, hey, okay, today's a day where a lightning strike or a cigarette butt may be enough to cause issues where I live. And so, yeah, just doing that risk assessment and deciding how likely something like this is. And so that if you do live in an area where fires are very prevalent, that you're aware of that and then can make plans accordingly. If you're in an area where fires are not as likely, let's put those lower on the list and address something that is more possible. And then when something does happen, when do you decide to evacuate? Do you have a plan in place for when to make that transition away from where you are? And if you do have that plan and decide that you are going to go somewhere, do you know what your routes are? Do you know what the different ways are to get out of where you are? And what if you needed to go on foot, where could you go? And how does that impact how you plan for these kinds of issues moving forward? For our homes, though I did put this as wildfires, homes and garden, or home and garden, I decided to break it up into two sections because there are different ways for us to look at each of these. When it comes to wildfires and like that risk assessment, is the home that we live in one that was built to resist fire? Do you have, no real easy places for sparks to catch, or those overhangs or eaves where the embers could lodge? What is the roof material, and is that fire resistant? Is the exterior made of an impermeable barrier that is not likely to catch fire like adobe or concrete or block or brick versus a stick-built home with siding on it? If it is something that has siding, is that a solid seam metal siding that is more or less sealed from, roof to ground, or something else? When we look at our homes, are we doing preparations ahead of fire season by doing things like clearing out our gutters and making sure that there isn't a place for any of that fiery debris to catch or to land? Are we bringing in any flammable materials that might be around our house in order to reduce the risk of something near the home catching? Are we using flame retardant or non-flammable curtains in our windows should there be a blossom of heat? And then when we look then from like that structure and the preparation that we can do immediately around it, moving into fire season and checking in over time, around the house further, do you have a break around your home in case a fire were to come through? Are you even in a place where you could create one? Because of, row homes in cities and the different policies and procedures and all the different rules and regulations that can determine how we manage our homes and the space around them, that if we're able to, it could be a good idea to build that break, to go 100 feet away from our home and then create a section that is 3 to 6 feet wide of stone, concrete, or bare earth that ring the home. And that can make a really big difference. Similarly, whether we are the homeowners or not, can we talk with our neighbors and others to make sure that if there are any tall trees, that they are at least as far away from habitable structures as they are tall, so that if they do catch fire and fall, they're less likely to impact a home? Or even if we want to take that far enough, to remove some of those trees that could pose a hazard, which then in turn would mean that they're no longer a risk to us because of removing them. Similarly, taking the time in our yard or homestead or neighborhood or community to go and collect any flammable material that could feed a fire, especially at that shrub layer, beneath the trees that surround where we live. I know that there was what was it? The previous president of the United States talked about going into the woods and raking them, and you hear it and it sounds ridiculous, but from a fire management perspective, removing that fuel can be vitally important to protecting human habitation. And putting that into our processes as permaculture designers to just do a walk around and make sure what fuel is being built up and what isn't. If you're in an area that allows them and have had the training or know somebody who you can bring in, being able to do controlled burns are something that I am a huge fan of for removing a lot of that dead woody material that just builds up over time because we don't allow fires to burn anymore. And that fire can be a valid tool when it comes to our fire management and mitigation strategies. Similarly, as we remove fuel that could feed fires near where we live, to also consider thinning trees outside that break. That, 100 feet from our home, we have that ring, that 3 to 6 foot wide ring of non-flammable material, stone, gravel, concrete, or bare earth. But on the other side of that, if we have trees, to thin them to make sure that there's room between the trees and their canopy, so that those drip lines that come in are at least 15 feet apart, so that if a fire does come through, it is less likely to jump from tree to tree. And so those are all kind of techniques and ideas that we can think about when we're putting together our design and considering what these risks are and where we are. Oh, as I get a message from my wife about a rogue chicken entering the Pentagon. And then from our home, I move us to our garden. And when it comes to planting gardens, choosing fire-resistant plants. That, we're looking for plants that have leaves that are moist and supple, that hold moisture throughout the year. And that when they do die back, that they leave very little dead wood or tend not to accumulate dry, dead material within the plant or around it. So it's, nothing kind of woody or super pithy or anything like that if it were to catch fire. I've posted here for firefree.org. I found this great document that they have, fire-resistant plants for home landscaping. That's from the Oregon State, which is it? Oregon and Washington State were partners on the document, but there's a lot of good information in there in doing the research to develop a fire-resistant planting for where you are. You can also, when putting my notes together for tonight, I found a lot of articles about fire-resistant plants in different areas and plants that were considered native to different regions, which were, not only the Southeast or the Southwest, but the Northwest, the Northeast. Lots of great information about that out there from a U.S. perspective, but I'm sure that you can, in your research as a designer, find the additional analogs that match that pretty well as well. And my last thought for the live stream this evening was on climate change. And, Jason, I've got... okay, your note here is about the no fire policies, and those are things that I certainly feel when it comes to fire management policies that we need to be advocating for them and to get more people who are doing controlled burns in, well, I don't want to say in, but teaching classes to people who are in positions to make decisions like that. The PASA, which used to be Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture, I think it's just PASA now, did a lot of really great like on-farm education programs where we talked about fuel and fire. When it comes to biochar, there was the one that I attended that there's some videos here on the YouTube channel for the podcast that were about like biodigesters, and so that could be a place to partner with those kinds of organizations. If you're someone in the permaculture community who does controlled burns and controlled burn education, reach out to them. Find your local community group or organization that is doing that kind of sustainability education and agriculture education. They tend to have a lot of pull and can bring people in who are in those positions to join their classes and be part of the conversation. And then as permaculture practitioners advocating for returning many of these practices to what it is that we're doing, because they're vital, valuable tools. And right now it's just been, just a lot of that's getting lost for these other plans that seem so much more complicated and difficult compared to what we can do with the indigenous land management practices. And Jason says that he saw a paper once that pointed out how mammoths stomping about created plains, and how it was quite a coincidence that their extinction coincided with a new fire regime where fire started doing that. It's something, I don't know, Jason, if you ever saw my tour of Horn Farm Center and the video with Wilson Alvarez and what he was doing to replicate the activities of humans, wolves, beavers, and pachyderms. And I think that's the Reintegration Project. Yeah, I can find it here on the YouTube channel. But that was an amazing conversation for me, because it's in reading like the impacts that these keystone species have, and what can we do to replicate some of those in our practices. Tending the wild is one of those pieces, Jason, that every couple of years I talk to M. Cat Anderson because I'd like to have her on the show. And this reminds me I need to follow up with her again, because she would not appear on the podcast until she had retired from her government work. And that's something that, I'd still like to have her on to talk about that book and her findings and what we can learn from her research and extant cultures on different ways to practice land management. So Jason continues that when mammoths died out, did the ancestors of Native Americans decide that it fell to them to take responsibility for the role they'd once played? And that makes me wonder, do we have an obligation now to take on that responsibility next? I certainly think that we have the obligation to take on that responsibility to the best of our abilities. I take a lot from Wilson's work with the Reintegration Project and seeing how quickly we can create radical change in the landscape by replicating what these species did previously, and then also taking up the efforts of those practices that replaced those animals when they were no longer there and no longer in a place to do that work, no longer in relationship with the land in the way that they were. And I think they're back to a story I was told once, which I don't know the validity of, about how the oral traditions of the Aboriginal communities in Australia are thousands and thousands and thousands of years old and determined a lot of what the tools and technologies were that were used. And a story that I heard, and this is something, Jason, if you've heard of this and know anything about its validity one way or the other, I'd love to know. Or even, if it's not true, I'd love to know how it continues to be perpetuated. But this idea that the Aboriginal folks in Australia were aware of the bow, but didn't adopt the bow and arrow as a hunting tool because of the stories of other of the impacts of that tool on the fauna that they hunted, and a concern about being able to take them too easily and staying with other tools instead. So, but as we have these cautionary tales in the modern age, then, hey Duke, the intern, giving some meows, and here he comes. Oh, kitty. I don't know how much we'll hear him on the microphone, but yeah, with those kinds of stories and cautionary tales, both traditionally and in the modern sense, what choices can we make based on that? As much as I know, Jason, you and I have talked about, there's Mr. Duke, how we can't escape society, and as much as we might want to reduce our consumption or some of these other ideas, then what can we do in that stead? I've been tossing around that if 2030 is the cutoff point for the mitigating the very worst of climate change, what can we do individually to have an impact while also working on that systemic change, because we're kind of at a place where both of them need to happen, which I guess I'll get to here in a little bit when it comes to this piece on climate change as I continue to work through the chat. Yes, now Duke's mom is back from her assignment, but he is going to be with us for another couple of weeks, so Duke will likely appear in some future live streams and other recordings here coming up, and then we'll be watching him off and on as necessary throughout the year. And Jason, yes, I think that we should be talking more about controlled burns rather than preventing fires. I don't see a reason to use all of these energy and labor-intensive techniques when we have fire available. And it works. And it's fairly well understood as a control technique, and yeah, could just be used more widely. And also because many species adapted with fires that no longer burn. And I wonder what would happen within the seed bank and what we would regenerate as a result of allowing those fires to burn, and what plants would come back to life and be restored if we were to change these management practices. And I think that we would see quite a bit of change in the process. But similarly, it was a conversation I had earlier today in my interview with Frankie Larson, which will be out sometime, I don't know. Talking with Frankie was one of the last conversations I needed to round out 2022, so that may be much later in the year, but yeah, we were just talking about the cost very often for land and all of these different techniques where, growing some plants out and putting them out there and letting them go to seed is a lot easier than many of these current practices that people engage in. That we can restore native landscapes in a lot of cases by leaving them alone for a couple of growing seasons and then go back in and selecting out what we don't want to be there, and then letting the rest continue to grow up. That many of these landscape rewilding projects aren't terribly difficult from a how do we do it perspective, but more like the physical techniques, how do we do it, but more how do we get large enough swaths of land into this space? How do we talk about interesting. Thank you, Jason, for clarifying that question about the Aboriginal story. Like I say, I don't recall, or redacted. Anyway, I saw enough of that to get an answer, but yeah, I'll look at that and share that later. And also not included in my conversations in the future. But where was that thought? Oh, yeah, just most of what we're trying to accomplish isn't terribly difficult, but it's getting people to have the conversations and to convert the land over into wildflowers, to get past the I can't read that. I can't read that. But yes, I will. I will catch up on the Aboriginal story of the bow and arrow, or I'll wind up getting deep into that conversation. But it's the same here with like designing for fire, and a lot of this mitigation is that I look at what has been looked at as the responsibility of government, and perhaps some of that has our ability as individuals to modify the landscape around us to make it safer has been handed off to government, while at the same time those government policies aren't necessarily using the best tools and techniques available. Yeah, we could get into a deep conversation about agency capture and agency regulations and why a lot of that happens, but that's probably best left as a conversation for another time. Suffice to say that, yes, I would advocate for more fires, more beavers, more wet places, and create restoration and conservation plans around the plants and animals that co-evolved together in a place over a period of time. We can get into the argument about native to when and some of those things, which I feel are less important over time, especially with the big question mark that I have up here on the screen when it comes to climate change. That's really going to be a big piece of where much of this goes. And I had a number of prompts and questions that I was going to put in here for climate change, but chose to go with the big question mark instead because I don't know that we really know what's going to be happening over even the next decade or so, let alone to be able to forecast well into the future. But what I do take away from what will come with climate change is that what we're used to won't be the same anymore. Some places will get wetter, some places will get drier, even though it seems like well, I guess it's because global warming is the terms that I grew up with. And so from like 88 till 98, a lot of what I encountered was about global warming. But there are places that are going to get warmer. There are places that will get colder compared to what they are now. Eventually, is that likely that will then spread out and become more even, more likely, and so that everywhere will be warmer consistently. But where and when and how the system is so complex and the changes are happening so rapidly that I don't know that we can adequately forecast in this moment what will happen. What I do know, though, here on the eastern seaboard is that the climate bands are moving north currently at a rate of several miles per year. And so the weather here in Northern Virginia is going to be more like North Carolina in another decade or two. Northern North Carolina is going to be more like Northern South Carolina at that same time. And this march is going to continue moving further and further north. I've seen and read all kinds of ideas of where the best places are going to be as climate change occurs and the weather gets warmer. But as a permaculture practitioner, I don't know that it's an appropriate ethical response just to pick up and move somewhere because I can. And so I want to look at how is climate change going to be changing the area that I'm in and be able to move plants and animals into what is forecast to be here in the future. That's where, bringing in those fire-resistant plants, drought-resistant plants, in case it does get drier. What plants are available that can survive being drier, but also won't die if they are inundated by moisture. As a permaculture practitioner, using that zone model to modify zone 1 to grow those plants that are the comfortable food that I enjoy eating and my community enjoys. That those are the places where we look to use as many tools and techniques as we can, because that's food and its importance. And that we may not be able to modify acres and acres and acres of land in order to grow at the kinds of commercial scales that are currently part of our commodity agriculture system. But instead we can use all of these tools that we have available to make a difference in a little area. Let me check the chat real quick and I'll get back. A couple more thoughts kind of brewing around climate change, but I'll pop back there in a second. Yes, Jason, I would agree that what will happen in the next 10 years, it's hard. And what you say about government is the world's biggest diffusion of responsibility machine, we just see so much of that in action right now. Like moment after moment, day after day, as like the least activity is chosen. The smallest possible choice is often neglected. And I don't know where it'll go. But we can just do the best that we can. And that's where I would try to, when it comes to climate change, the plans that I would be implementing right now would not be for what the world would look like 10 years from now, but what I could expect the world to look like 50 years in this area from now. So if the climate continues to move northward and that rate is accelerating, then maybe I'm going to be looking at South Carolina as the current climate analog that I want to replicate here in Northern Virginia. That I'm looking several hundred miles south from where I am to see what might be coming. And use that as the model. Check out that place now as it currently exists, find out what people are growing, how it's growing there, and then see what I can adapt to what's here. And then also use that as an opportunity to naturalize seeds and plants to my area well before they are needed, so that we can have them available. And that's where my thoughts are on designing for climate change in general are at the moment, but also to use all the tools that we discussed in the stream so far about designing for fire and the concern for wildfires and looking at our houses and communities. And so if we do a renovation, what can we do to renovate our home to make it more fire resistant? If we are in a place where we're looking to build or buy a home, finding one that matches those check marks and purchasing, renting, however we come about it, that a house that meets those requirements now, so we're ready for it in the future. Similarly, when it comes to, any disaster and planning for it, if we can track it out and figure it out, if it's flooding, being, not being on a floodplain, knowing where those 100-year floods are, and kind of trying to do a short-term planning that gives us what we need right now in the moment, but then when we look at that 50-year period out, how can we integrate all of those changes that could come into what it is we're doing right now? And being a time scout, looking way out there into the future and using what could happen and we can see based on the research and other information, and just applying it now as much as we can. And that's where conversations like this, if there's something that comes up that you are working on and this conversation sparks a thought, definitely get in touch with me so that we can continue the conversation. I'm always, as much as I sit in this seat, have these conversations, reading all the books, all this stuff all the time, it's really helpful to hear from everybody in the listening community, because I know that I only see so much of what's happening. There's only so many things can come across my radar that I can interact with or do something about. So anything that you can share with me is greatly appreciated. And back in here into the chat real quick. If you have any questions while I'm reading this and getting caught up, feel free to drop them in there. If there's any comments on anything that I said that you'd like me to dive into further or consider for a future video, please share that as well. Jason, incorporating Scrum into permaculture practice. The unpredictability of climate change reminds me of the unpredictability of a big software project. I wonder if there's some meat there to dig into. Sprints, then retro. I think that reading through that, Jason, I imagine that Scrum would help to formalize the conversation around how to use and apply the techniques and principles of permaculture more rigorously, and that we would likely then actually do some of the accepting feedback and the small, slow solutions. And yeah, I think we could probably have a conversation on integrating Scrum into permaculture as a way to make more useful or valuable decisions with permaculture. It's part of what came out of the conversation with Rosemary Morrow. Some of the other pieces that I've been talking with folks about when it comes to permaculture education is that a lot of this, what Bill taught in the initial permaculture design course and what the permaculture design course are now are, I think, largely in name only. Because Bill's expectations from having spoken with people who studied with him on his first tour through the United States was that it was for people who were already landscape professionals, already people who were engaged in some kind of practice that they could just apply the ethics and principles to, because they already had the techniques and it was just a matter of making more integrated decisions. But now I feel like the PDC has become more about drinking from the fire hose and getting as much information into students' hands that they could find useful as opposed to what they would necessarily apply. And as a result of that, the actual design processes and conversations about design have kind of lost their importance. And so it's, we talk about the ethics, we talk about the principles, we talk about the ways to create base maps and what we're looking for in order to create something that is integrated, but then it rapidly falls to a conversation about all the techniques that descend from that, rather than necessarily working the design, which is what permaculture really, for me, stands out as the primary focus is the design, because the design answers all the questions. And if you can't answer a question based on your design, then, what are you missing? What is missing from the design? And then as you fill in those holes, it should answer everything else. But I'll be getting into that here in one of the upcoming live streams to discuss the technique trap. Yeah, that's in a couple of weeks. I'll pull up the slide here in a few minutes that shows a bit about what will be coming up in conversations in case there's anything that you'd like me to dig into on any of those subjects, or if you'd like to suggest a subject in the future. I do not know what tegus are. I will have to look that up. Or tegus? Yeah, I'm not even sure how to pronounce that, Nathan, but I will take a look and find out. Yeah, I don't know where I'm drawing a blank on that. Corinne, you ask, considering the frame of new construction, what are your favorite materials to use and what to avoid? A lot of that depends on where I'm at and what the prevailing conditions are. Here in the Mid-Atlantic, timber frame with wattle and daub infill is a pretty amazing construction material, and my understanding is that when it's done well, because of the plastered exterior and interior walls, plural of tegu, big lizards, or they're, what are the big lizards people keep as pets? Iguanas. Are tegu related to iguanas at all? Is that another name for iguanas? And but yeah, to your question, Corinne, it depends. It depends widely. If I were in an area that I say that, but to do something like a timber frame with wattle and daub infill, you need a pretty decent overhang in order to prevent that plaster from getting super saturated in a storm, and to be willing to go back and patch or replaster that material over time. I'm a big fan of straw bale construction, again, because of the heavy lime plasters that go on those walls. They tend to be breathable, not necessarily hold a lot of moisture, and can also be very fire resistant if well planned. Obviously, thatch is not a roofing material that I would use in an area that is in any way prone to fire, because of the risk of it catching fire. From some folks who I've known over the years, such as the now no longer active Push, my understanding is that wood siding and wood shingled roofs can be fire resistant, depending on what you're using, though of course fire resistant is not fireproof, so there can be some concerns there. Okay, iguanas are invasive too. Yeah, I will have to look them up. Does not ring a bell at all. Tegu and iguanas. Stone, of course, if you're in a place that there is enough stone, is a great material that lasts for ages. Brick is very good. I'm a fan of adobe in drier climates. I don't know how it handles in wet climates. It's just not something that I've had any conversations or experience with. Really, about the only thing that I would avoid is like modern stick-built construction. That's the piece that kind of makes me go, just because a lot of the materials that are used these days are not really resistant to a lot of what we encounter. They're really good for putting up a shell quick. I mean, throwing 2x4s together for a frame, getting your insulation and everything in place, your vapor barrier, putting that external shell on, you can create a wonderfully habitable home really quickly with those methods. And I don't fault them for being used, but in the world to come, would like to see us move away from some of that. Just a moment, just a cough real quick. When it comes to roofs, I love standing seam metal roofs. They seal just incredibly well. With the right insulation between those and whatever your roofing material are, can insulate from having hot debris on a roof. Combine that with wide metal gutters that are easy to flush. You don't need to worry as much about material building up in the gutters because you're keeping out a lot of that debris, but can easily then go up, pop up an end, put a hose in the end and just wash your gutters out rather than needing to climb up and uncap and empty them by hand. Slate roofs, of course, though they are extraordinarily expensive anymore. With that, the other piece is if you spend the money on the construction up front and get a home that you love and is habitable for generations, then it's likely worth that cost. While at the same time considering that, to have a home that has all the requirements that you're looking for may mean that you then wind up with a smaller house than what you might want otherwise. I think of some friends who have a home that is pushing 5,000 square feet, if I remember right. It's like 14 or 1,600 square feet per floor, and they have 3 floors. And it's just, I can't imagine having something that big because of all of the maintenance that goes into it and everything else. While at the same time, many of the materials that were used are not the ones that will stand up against climate change, because the siding is, a vinyl or vinyl composite. The, even to get a deck built these days out of wood is incredibly difficult because of how much material has moved to composite. Whether or, just full extruded PVC, which are all things that I would avoid in a home as well. Some places, milk carton roofs, that I'm not familiar with enough. I've heard about some people taking certain plastics and mixing them with, what is it? Is it borax or gypsum in order to make them fire resistant? And there's plenty of room for us to look for new materials. So I'm always interested in that as well. But, or what is it? Like the insulated, they're construction panels, and I'm forgetting the name of them right now, but they're essentially like a foam and concrete I-beam kind of construction that are panels that can just be dropped in and formed up, that I think have a lot of promise depending on what's going into them. There's just so many neat options that are available for new construction, but the 2 biggest hurdles for those are your cost of materials and finding someone who is knowledgeable in order to perform the labor. Not that necessarily the labor that's involved is particularly difficult, but that not a lot of people know how to do it. My father was a carpenter, a trained carpenter, and could do everything from make furniture to fine carpentry to build houses. But even in those conversations, there were only certain things that he knew or could do, and would often lament how, and this is, from his perspective and perhaps his bias, how construction had changed, that it's become perceived that much of construction is unskilled labor because of being able to, make some measurements and swing a hammer, rather than approaching it as the skilled labor that it is, and just people not being in a place to gain those skills. Nathan, you mentioned Milk Carton Roofs and Yanto Evans' books. Evans' book, is his book The Handmade House? Is that or the hand sculpted house, something like that, where he's talking about cob? Oh, that's another great material. I really like cob. It's super fascinating to me, and I know I've helped build cob ovens, though have never done anything that I would say is structural with it. But I think it is another amazingly promising construction material that has a lot of history around the world. Trying to think. In the moment, that covers everything that that comes to mind about construction materials and different ways to examine that. There's also, if you've never read it, Lloyd Kahn, I think it is, did a bunch of books on tiny houses, but his first big book was Shelter. It's this gorgeous big book about just what it means to have a place to live, and is a book that I would highly recommend picking up and giving a read if you haven't. Plus Lloyd is quite a character. I got to meet him a number of years ago. But there's a lot of space for alternative options when we're looking at this. And what I shared is really just kind of an overview of what I've encountered here as the host of the show. The other piece that comes to mind also is The Barefoot Architect is another book that I'd highly recommend. Thank you, Nathan, for clarifying. Hand Sculpted Home from Yanto Evans. Yeah, I have a copy of that somewhere. I can always bring that up in a discussion or do a review about it sometime in the future. But The Barefoot Architect is one that I would combine with many of these conversations about construction or homes or locating ourselves or community, because it's this thick book, like, I don't know, probably 400 pages, if not more. And it's mostly pictures with some very minimal descriptions throughout, talking about how we design where we live, from our homes themselves all the way up to our city centers. And like street alignments and plazas and all of these others are really, they're just fascinating. Ways to get from where we are to where we want to be as permaculture practitioners. Hempcrete, Corinne, you raise anything related to concrete because of what goes into creating the materials that are necessary to make a pourable, curable product. I'm still not sold on, just because of the embodied energy that goes into that. And I'm certainly hoping that people can continue to do that research, but there are other methods that are already commercially viable and available that are less expensive and have less of an impact on greenhouse gases and the energy required to produce them. It's also that I'm interested in, kind of to take us on a tangent from here, I'm also interested in materials that can be created and built locally on site for generations to come. And so that's where some of the plasters for wattle and daub or timber framing or straw bale, some of those cob, thinking of hempcrete, I would almost rather do a what is it? There's a technique where you use logs as your structural material held together with mortar or slip or concrete. I will have to look that up. The name of it is escaping me in the moment, but like I think that has a quicker applicability to what it is, that it has a faster adaptability and is quicker to apply right now and can be taught already than some of these industrial materials that are required to be imported to where we are. But that's just another consideration that is part of my long-term planning from a permaculture perspective, is if we go back to the roots of permaculture and energy descent and not having access to readily available sources of fossil fuels, if we're not able to acquire all of these materials of civilization and be able to use them where we are, I don't know how viable they are as a material long term. But like I say, I am totally down for being proven wrong, or for having somebody point out that these are things that can be made on site or used easily, or that they have in some way found a way around some of the industrial processes involved, or ways that they could be used on site. Like growing hemp and using it in place of straw for making plasters or for cob, awesome. Like immediately applicable, totally usable right now. Yeah, there's just so many different ways to approach the way that we do this, and that's where I think that we will see over time local solutions continue to arise, and people in different areas providing us the lessons that we need where we are right now. But if I could get rid of one thing from the construction industry right now, it would be all of the vinyl that is going into siding and planking and all of these other places where it's used that, need to be replaced over time and are, can be melted and just don't stand up in a rigorous way. And so that we can build houses that can be repaired and passed down for generations. And hopefully we can overcome some of the financial issues that currently exist for housing and find a way to be able to get these ideas into people's hands. And it goes back to many, many years ago when I interviewed the architect Bob Tice, which if you haven't heard those, I need to check and see if Bob is still around. But I enjoyed those conversations with Bob so much because it was we can do all kinds of stuff, but do we wanna? Like, there's tons of beautiful land out there that doesn't need us on it. And there's all of these amazing homes that just need us to show up and renovate them, restore them, use all of the tools and techniques that we have available to us as permaculture practitioners and give them a second life that can last for generations. And in doing so, be able to teach people who might live in that home or on that land in the future all the tools and information they need to repair it moving forward. And there's, I guess, my mini soapbox when it comes to homes and houses and these other things. And that, I also like the idea of multifamily dwellings because of being able to bring so many people together into one place, to be able to share walls with one another, and as a result minimize the number of resources that we need. That, I'd rather have 4 houses sprawling over 10,000, 4 families living in a large building that sprawls out over 8 or 10,000 square feet in an area that's fire prone, because they can work together to develop that entire area as a place that is fire resistant. They can assist one another when those gutters need cleaned. They can prepare for the fire season. They can, walk the area, particularly like if the land is is in commons for the people who live there, to be able to walk that land and look for things that are flammable and work together. But that's just not where we live right now. And so, what can we do to renovate, restore, and prepare where it is that we're already living for these eventualities, including fire? So, If you have any questions to round out this conversation, I'm going to start to draw it here to a close if you don't, but I'm going to go ahead and drop some information up on the screen and talk about that for a few minutes, give you some time because of the delay between when I'm talking about it here in my office and when it appears in the stream. So go ahead and drop anything into the chat that comes to mind in the time that we have remaining. I'll answer those and then we'll draw this to a close. As I say, I always like to hear from you, so if you'd like to get in touch, feel free to, as soon as my window works with me, Feel free to send me an email if you're watching this and you have any questions or would like to suggest a topic for an upcoming live stream or want to point out anything that I said that you have other information on. I'd love to hear from you. You can also, if you prefer, hold on, I did not drop that graphic in. Let me grab it real quick. As you can see, reworked the graphics for tonight's live stream, so I've got some stuff going together. Let's go ahead and drop this on here. If you want to, you can also call, text, or WhatsApp me at 717-827-6266. Here in the United States, that's a +1 if you're outside the country. If you enjoyed this live stream, then consider becoming a member of the Patreon community at patreon.com/permaculturepodcast. I post weekly updates about what's going on behind the scenes, what I've been working on for the show. There are monthly AMA threads and all kinds of other things to participate in, though I believe everybody in the chat so far have or are currently Patreon supporters. Thank you all very much for that. It's been very helpful in keeping the show on the air all these years. And then finally, I've also got the upcoming live streams. The next one is going to be about focusing on design, which is that conversation about what do we do to keep going back to that design? How do we refine our design so that it answers questions? That'll be on Thursday, February 17th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Of course, all of these videos stay up on the podcast YouTube channel, so if you're not able to join me then, feel free to watch it on replay, and of course get in touch if you would like. After that, on March 1st, which will be our next evening live stream, is a permaculture livelihood. And this is going back to that conversation about making a living with our permaculture practices. I've had some more meanderings talking with some people about it. There's the conversation that I released with Della Z. Duncan from that guest interview with Karin Olson talking about this, and I kind of want to revisit it again with some of the things that I've learned since then. And we'll likely recap some of the material as well. And then to follow up on Focus on Design, we'll be discussing the technique trap from likely the permaculture design course and some of the other places where we learn permaculture, and how it's really easy to wind up talking just about techniques because they're flashy, they're easy, they're the things that we interact with, they're things that people get to see. Whereas for me, they're such a small part of the actual work and practice of permaculture, and that I understand how we get there, but let's have some conversations about getting away from that and moving back into a focus on design. So thank you everybody for joining me tonight. This is my first run, as I say, with the new graphics, and I realize there are some changes that I will be making there. I'm running a new camera tonight, which is, man, the picture quality is radically different, and I'm really loving the look. And it's one that I can also shoot video with in the field. Really does a nice all-around package. And then, as you'll see here on my shirt, I have a lavalier mic tonight that is getting my dulcet tones into your ears through my computer, and I'm really happy with the way that sounded in my test runs earlier. So if you have any feedback on the way this looks, on the way I sound, or anything like that, please certainly do get in touch. It's what you share with me is what helps me keep continuing to improve the show. And yeah, I'll keep on doing this as long as I can and as long as folks keep showing up. But thank you for being here with me this evening, and I will catch you all again in a few weeks. So take care, everybody, and good night.